Have you ever stopped to wonder why, even knowing something is bad for you, you keep doing it? Why does that cigarette, that drink, that toxic relationship, or even that procrastination keep coming back, as if they had a life of their own? What if I told you this isn't weakness, it isn't lack of willpower, but actually a message? Carl Jung, the revolutionary Swiss psychoanalyst, discovered something disturbing. Our addictions, compulsions, and destructive behaviors aren't just bad habits. They are the voice of the unconscious, desperately trying to tell us something we refuse to hear. It's God speaking through the demon. It's your shadow screaming for attention. While you fight the symptom, the real problem remains buried, pulsing in the depths of your psyche. Most people live their entire lives without realizing there's a hidden instinct governing their choices. Brace yourself. What you're about to discover in the next few minutes could completely change the way you see yourself. There's something living inside you that knows more about your life than your conscious mind ever will. Jung called it the unconscious, and it speaks in a language most people spend their entire existence trying to ignore. This voice doesn't use words like the ones you're reading right now. It speaks through impulses, through sudden urges, through behaviors that seem to hijack your willpower when you least expect it. When you reach for that bottle at 3 in the morning, when you sabotage the relationship that could actually make you happy, when you destroy opportunities right before they bloom, that's not random chaos, that's communication. The problem is, we've been taught to silence this voice. Society trains us from childhood to suppress, to control, to present a polished version of ourselves to the world. We learn early that certain feelings are unacceptable, certain desires are shameful, certain parts of who we are must be locked away in the basement of our psyche. But here's what nobody tells you. Whatever you lock away doesn't disappear. It grows stronger in the darkness, it feeds on your denial, and eventually it finds a way to break through the walls you've built. Jung understood that human beings aren't simple creatures. We're not just the person we see in the mirror each morning, putting on a smile and heading out into the world. We're layers upon layers of consciousness, built up over millions of years of evolution. Deep in those layers, beneath all the social conditioning and learned behaviors, there's something primal, something wild, something that remembers what it was like before civilization tried to tame us into acceptable shapes. This primal part doesn't care about your career goals or your social image. It doesn't care if you're supposed to be a good person according to the rules you learned in school. It cares about survival in the deepest sense, not just physical survival, but psychological survival. It cares about wholeness, and when you ignore it for too long, when you push it down and pretend it doesn't exist, it stops asking nicely for your attention. Instead, it starts screaming, and its screams come in forms you might not recognize. That addiction you can't shake, that's a scream. That anger that explodes at the smallest things, that's a scream. That emptiness you feel even when your life looks perfect on paper, that's a scream. Most people hear these screams and think something is broken. They think they need to fix themselves, to try harder, to have more discipline. But Jung saw something different. He saw that these symptoms aren't the disease. They're the diagnosis trying to deliver itself. Think about pain in your body for a moment. When you touch a hot stove, pain shoots through your hand. That pain isn't there to torture you. It's information. It's your body's way of saying something is wrong and you need to pay attention right now. The pain is protection, even though it hurts. The same is true for psychological pain, for compulsions, for all the ways your unconscious tries to grab your attention. They hurt, yes. They disrupt your life, absolutely. But they're trying to protect you from something worse, from a deeper fracture that you haven't acknowledged yet. The tragedy is that most people spend enormous energy fighting their symptoms without ever asking what those symptoms are trying to say. They go to war with themselves, treating their own psyche like an enemy that must be defeated. And in that war, everyone loses. because you can't defeat a part of yourself. You can only exhaust yourself trying. What Jung discovered is that the path forward isn't through more control, more willpower, more suppression. It's through listening. It's through having the courage to ask why this voice is speaking and what it's desperately trying to tell you about the life you're living. This is where most self-help advice fails completely. It tells you to be stronger, to resist temptation, to overcome your weaknesses. But resistance only makes the voice louder. Suppression only makes it more creative in finding ways to break through. The real question isn't how to silence the voice. The real question is what happens when you finally stop running and turn around to face it. What happens when you realize that the monster chasing you through your dreams is actually carrying a message you need to survive. This is where everything changes, where the real work begins. What if everything you've been told about addiction is backwards? What if the thing you're running toward, the substance or behavior you can't seem to quit, isn't the actual problem, but a desperate solution to a problem you haven't named yet? Jung saw addiction not as a moral failing or a disease of weak character, but as a misguided search for wholeness. When something essential is missing from your life, when there's a hole in your soul that nothing seems to fill, your psyche will find something to fill it with. And it will keep reaching for that something, even when your rational mind knows it's destroying you. Every addiction is a replacement. It's a stand-in for what you really need, but don't know how to find or don't believe you deserve. The alcoholic isn't really thirsty for alcohol. The smoker isn't really craving nicotine. These are symbols, substitutes for something deeper and more fundamental that's been missing, sometimes for years, sometimes since childhood. The addiction becomes a kind of prayer, a ritual repeated over and over in the hope that this time it will finally deliver what the soul is actually hungry for. But here's the key insight that changes everything. The addiction is also a map. If you can decode it, if you can look past the surface behavior and ask what it's really seeking, it will show you exactly what's been neglected in your life. The workaholic who can't stop even when their health is failing isn't addicted to work itself. They're running from emptiness, from feelings they've never learned to process, from a sense of worthlessness that only achievement seems to quiet. The work is medicating something, numbing something, filling a space that should be occupied by genuine self-worth or human connection. Jung talked about the spiritual dimension of this search. He famously said that every addiction is a spiritual crisis, a soul sickness that can't be cured by addressing only the physical or psychological symptoms. This doesn't mean addiction is about religion. It means there's something transcendent missing, something that gives life meaning beyond just surviving another day. Modern society is exceptionally good at teaching people how to produce, how to consume, how to compete. It's terrible at teaching people how to simply be, how to connect with something larger than their individual ego, how to feel like they belong to the universe. When that connection is severed, people feel lost in a way that has no name. They feel like strangers in their own lives, going through motions that seem increasingly pointless. And in that lostness, addiction offers a brief escape, a moment where the existential pain stops and something else takes over. It's not pleasure they're chasing, not really. It's relief from the unbearable weight of feeling disconnected from everything that matters. The message hidden in addiction is almost always about authenticity. It's about the gap between who you really are and who you've been trying to be. Maybe you're living a life that looks good on paper but feels dead inside. Maybe you're pretending to be satisfied with things that don't actually nourish you. Maybe you've buried your real dreams so deep that you've forgotten they exist. The addiction steps in to bridge that gap, to provide some kind of feeling, any feeling, in a life that's become numb. This is why simply removing the addiction without addressing what it's pointing toward rarely works long-term. You can go to rehab, you can use all your willpower to quit, you can replace one addiction with another slightly less destructive one. But if the underlying hunger remains unaddressed, if the message goes unheard, something else will rise up to take its place. The psyche will keep trying to communicate, keep trying to push you toward the life you're meant to be living, instead of the one you've settled for. Understanding addiction as a messenger means approaching it with curiosity instead of shame. Instead of asking, "Why are you so weak?" the question becomes, "What are you not getting that you desperately need?" Instead of fighting the symptom with brute force, you start investigating the conditions that made the symptom necessary in the first place. This shift in perspective is revolutionary because it transforms you from a broken thing that needs fixing into a whole person whose system is actually working correctly by sending up flares about what needs attention. The path out of addiction, then, isn't about becoming stronger than your urges. It's about becoming honest enough to see what those urges represent. It's about building a life where the real needs get met, where the hunger finds appropriate food, where the soul finds what it's been searching for all along. When that happens, the addiction often falls away naturally, not because you fought it into submission, but because it's no longer needed. The messenger has delivered its message and can finally rest. If you feel ready to dive deeper into your own mind and balance both your light and shadow, explore the SIM Method ebook. It's a practical guide that helps you awaken your inner strength in just 5 minutes a day. The link is waiting for you in the first pinned comment. There's a part of you that you've never met, but it's been making decisions for you since before you could form memories. Jung called this the shadow, and it's not some abstract concept from psychology textbooks. It's the accumulation of everything you've been told is unacceptable about yourself, everything you've pushed down and pretended doesn't exist, everything that doesn't fit the image you want to project to the world. And here's the disturbing truth. The more you deny its existence, the more power it has over your life. The shadow forms early. When you're a child and you express anger and your parents tell you good boys don't get angry, part of your anger gets pushed into the shadow. When you feel jealous and you're taught that jealousy is ugly, that jealousy goes into the shadow. When you have desires that your religion or culture says are sinful, those desires don't disappear. They go underground. They join everything else in the shadow, waiting in the dark, growing stronger through neglect. Most people walk around thinking they know themselves. They have a story about who they are, what they believe, what they would and wouldn't do. But the shadow contains all the evidence that contradicts that story. It holds all the impulses you've disowned, all the potential you've rejected, all the parts of human nature you find too uncomfortable to claim as your own. And because you won't look at it directly, it runs your life from behind the scenes. This is why you do things that baffle you afterward. This is why you sabotage yourself right when success is within reach. This is why you hurt the people you love most. The shadow doesn't care about your conscious intentions. It has its own agenda, its own needs, its own way of asserting itself. And it will use whatever means necessary to be acknowledged, even if that means destroying the life you've carefully constructed on the surface. Jung discovered that the shadow doesn't just contain negative qualities. It also holds positive traits that you rejected because they didn't fit your self-image. Maybe you learned early that being too confident was arrogant, so you pushed your natural boldness into the shadow. Maybe you were told that wanting attention was selfish, so you suppressed your need to be seen. Maybe you decided that being powerful was dangerous, so you made yourself small. All of that rejected potential sits in the shadow, unused, festering, occasionally breaking through in ways that shock you. The shadow reveals itself in projection. Whatever you strongly dislike in other people is usually something you can't acknowledge in yourself. The things that trigger you most violently, the qualities that make you irrationally angry or disgusted when you see them in others, those are your shadow speaking. It's showing you what you've buried. And until you recognize this mechanism, you'll keep encountering the same types of people, the same situations, the same conflicts, because the universe keeps putting mirrors in front of you, hoping you'll finally look at what's really there. Integration is the work Jung prescribed, but integration is terrifying. It means admitting that you're capable of everything you judge in others. It means acknowledging that the monster isn't out there, it's in here. It means taking ownership of all the dark impulses, the shameful thoughts, the unacceptable desires, not acting on them, but acknowledging they exist. Because only what's acknowledged can be consciously directed. What remains in darkness directs you. When you start to integrate the shadow, something strange happens. You become more whole, but also more humble. You can't maintain the same self-righteous certainty about being a good person when you've seen what's lurking in your own depths. But you also become more powerful, because energy that was tied up in suppression gets released. You become more authentic, because you're no longer performing a sanitized version of yourself. And paradoxically, you become less likely to act on your darker impulses, because they lose their power when they're no longer forbidden. The shadow wants consciousness. It wants to be seen, to be heard, to be integrated into the whole person you could become. Every time you reject it, every time you say, "That's not me," about some uncomfortable truth, you give it more power to control you unconsciously. But when you turn toward it, when you say, "Yes, that's also me," something shifts. The energy transforms. The compulsion loses its grip. You begin to have actual choice instead of just reacting to forces you don't understand. This is why the spiritual traditions talk about facing the demon or wrestling with the devil. They're not talking about external evil. They're talking about this confrontation with everything you've rejected in yourself. They're talking about the courage it takes to look at your own shadow and not run away screaming. Because on the other side of that confrontation is freedom. Not the freedom from having a shadow, because that never goes away, but the freedom of knowing it's there and choosing how to work with it instead of being its puppet. Buried beneath layers of civilization and conditioning, there's an instinct so fundamental that forgetting it is like forgetting how to breathe. Jung spent years studying what he called the collective unconscious, the deep layer of psyche that all humans share. The ancestral memory that whispers truths our modern minds have learned to ignore. In that collective unconscious lives an instinct for wholeness, for completion, for becoming fully who you are meant to be. He called this process individuation, but the instinct itself is older than any name we could give it. This instinct knows that you're not supposed to be just one thing. You're not just good or bad, strong or weak, rational or emotional. You're meant to hold contradictions, to embody opposites, to be vast enough to contain multitudes. But modern life demands simplification. Pick a career path, choose a personality type, decide who you are, and stick to it. This demand for consistency, for a clear and unchanging identity, goes against the fundamental instinct to grow, to transform, to integrate all the different aspects of being human. When you ignore this instinct, when you try to freeze yourself into a fixed identity, something inside you starts to die. You might call it depression or anxiety or a midlife crisis. But what it really is your psyche rebelling against stagnation. The instinct for wholeness never stops pushing, never stops trying to move you toward completion, even when you've decided you're done growing. It creates restlessness. It creates dissatisfaction with things that should make you happy. It creates a nagging sense that something is wrong even when everything looks right. Our ancestors lived closer to this instinct. They had rituals and myths and ceremonies that acknowledged the need for transformation. They understood that a person isn't fully formed at birth or even at adulthood. They saw life as a series of deaths and rebirths, each stage requiring you to let go of who you were to become who you needed to be next. But we've lost most of those containers for transformation. We're expected to build an identity in our 20s and maintain it until we die, with maybe one or two approved changes along the way. The instinct for wholeness doesn't accept these limitations. It pushes against them. It sends dreams that disturb you, intuitions that don't make logical sense, longings for things you can't name. It creates what Jung called the transcendent function, the psyche's natural ability to create something new from the tension between opposites. But this function only works if you're willing to hold the tension, to sit with contradictions instead of rushing to resolve them into comfortable simplicity. Think about how you feel when you're living authentically versus when you're performing a role. There's a different quality to your energy, isn't there? When you're aligned with this deeper instinct, there's a sense of rightness, of flow, even when things are difficult. But when you're betraying it, when you're trying to force yourself into a shape that isn't yours, there's exhaustion, there's resistance, there's a constant low-grade misery that no amount of success or comfort can fix. The forgotten instinct speaks through your body. It creates tension in your shoulders when you're carrying a burden that isn't yours. It creates tightness in your chest when you're suppressing something that needs to be expressed. It creates fatigue when you're spending energy maintaining a false self. Most people medicate these physical symptoms without ever asking what they're communicating. They take pills for the tension, for the insomnia, for the digestive issues, treating their body like a malfunctioning machine instead of a wise messenger. Jung believed that neurosis isn't a breakdown, but a breakthrough trying to happen. What we call mental illness is often the psyche's dramatic attempt to force transformation when all gentler methods have been ignored. The instinct for wholeness will not be denied forever. If you won't listen to the whispers, you'll get the screams. If you won't make space for growth consciously, it will happen unconsciously, often in ways that look like disaster from the outside, but are actually necessary destruction of structures that were preventing you from becoming whole. Reclaiming this instinct means learning to trust processes you can't control. It means accepting that you don't know who you're becoming, that you can't plan and manage your way into wholeness. It requires a kind of surrender that terrifies the ego, because the ego wants to be in charge, wants to direct the show, wants to know how the story ends. But the instinct for wholeness is wiser than the ego. It knows things your conscious mind can't access. It's connected to something larger than your individual life. When you start working with this instinct instead of against it, life becomes simultaneously easier and more challenging. Easier because you're not fighting your own nature anymore, not trying to maintain an impossible consistency, not exhausting yourself with pretense. More challenging because growth hurts, transformation requires sacrifice, and becoming whole means facing everything you've been avoiding. But it's the kind of challenge that makes you feel alive, instead of the kind that slowly kills you from the inside out. There's a moment in every life when everything falls apart, when the structures you've built crumble, when the identity you've maintained can no longer hold. Most people experience this as pure catastrophe, as evidence that something has gone terribly wrong. But Jung saw these moments differently. He saw them as sacred, as moments when something larger than your conscious will is breaking through, rearranging your life to reflect a deeper truth you've been avoiding. This is when the divine speaks loudest. Not through peace and order, but through chaos and destruction. The ego hates chaos. It wants control, predictability, safety. It builds walls and makes plans and tries to ensure that nothing unexpected disturbs the carefully constructed life. But the self, the deeper center of the psyche that Jung identified, has different priorities. The self wants truth. It wants wholeness. And it will sacrifice the ego's comfort without hesitation if that's what truth and wholeness require. When your life explodes, when addiction destroys your marriage, when illness stops you in your tracks, when sudden loss tears apart everything you thought was permanent, That's often the self-making space for something new. This doesn't mean chaos is good, or that suffering has some pleasant purpose that makes it okay. It means that the psyche has its own intelligence, and sometimes that intelligence uses crisis as a tool for transformation when nothing else has worked. You can spend years in therapy talking about change. You can read books, attend workshops, make plans for becoming a better version of yourself. But real transformation often happens in an instant, in a moment of complete breakdown, when the old self can no longer maintain its grip. Jung studied religious experiences and mystical traditions because he recognized that they understood something psychology had forgotten. They knew that the encounter with the divine is rarely comfortable. It's overwhelming. It shatters your categories. It demands surrender of everything you thought you knew. The burning bush, the voice from the whirlwind, the dark night of the soul. These aren't metaphors for pleasant spiritual feelings. They're descriptions of what happens when something infinitely larger than your ego breaks into your life and refuses to be ignored. Your addiction, your compulsion, your complete inability to control this one thing that's ruining your life might be exactly this kind of breaking in. It might be the way the universe is trying to get your attention, to force you to look at what you've been avoiding, to destroy the false self so the true self has room to emerge. The addict who loses everything and finally, in desperation, turns inward and begins the real work of transformation. That person isn't recovering from a disease. They're answering a call that had to get loud enough to be heard over the noise of their defended life. This is why hitting bottom can be the beginning of wisdom. Not because suffering is good, but because it's often only at the bottom that people stop trying to manage and control and finally open themselves to something they can't manipulate. The instinct for self-preservation that normally keeps you safe, that tells you to avoid pain at all costs, that instinct has to be overwhelmed before you'll take the risk of real transformation. Crisis provides that overwhelming force. The challenge is learning to read the chaos instead of just surviving it. When your life falls apart, there's information in the pattern of how it breaks. What goes first? What remains standing? What do you reach for in desperation? What do you discover you can live without? These aren't random details. They're the architecture of your psyche revealing itself. They show you what was real and what was pretense, what was necessary and what was just familiar, what was yours and what you were carrying for others. God speaking through chaos doesn't mean there's a bearded figure in the sky directing your suffering. It means there's an intelligence in the universe or in the deep psyche or in the collective unconscious that's larger than your individual will and has a different agenda than your comfort. Jung was careful to say he didn't know if this intelligence was inside or outside, whether it was a property of the human psyche or something transcendent. But he knew it was real because he saw it operating in every life he studied, including his own. The religious impulse that's built into human nature, the need for meaning and connection to something larger, this impulse doesn't go away just because you don't believe in traditional religion. It finds other outlets, it speaks through other voices. And when those voices are ignored, when that fundamental need for connection to the transcendent is suppressed, it will create crises that force the issue. Your breakdown might be your soul's way of staging an intervention, of saying you can't keep living this small, this defended, this cut off from what matters most. Learning to listen to chaos means developing a different relationship with control. It means accepting that you don't run the show, that there are forces at work in your life that don't consult your preferences. But it also means trusting that those forces aren't random, aren't just cruel accidents. There's pattern in the chaos. There's meaning in the destruction. And if you can stay present to the process, instead of just trying to make it stop, you might discover that what looked like the end of your world was actually the beginning of your real life. The thing you're most afraid to look at holds the key to your freedom. Jung spent his career observing this pattern, Whatever people run from most desperately is exactly where their healing lives. The relationship you avoid, the conversation you won't have, the emotion you can't let yourself feel, the truth you refuse to acknowledge, somewhere in that avoidance is the medicine you need. But it's hidden behind fear so intense that most people choose to stay sick rather than face what's waiting in the darkness. This runs completely counter to instinct. Every fiber of your being tells you to avoid pain, to stay away from what hurts, to protect yourself from experiences that feel dangerous. And sometimes that instinct is right, sometimes avoidance is wisdom. But other times, especially when it comes to psychological growth, avoidance is the very thing keeping you trapped. You're not avoiding the danger, you're avoiding the cure. And the longer you avoid it, the more power it gains over your life. Think about the patterns that keep repeating. The same fights in every relationship. The same self-sabotage right before success. The same empty feeling no matter what you achieve. These patterns persist because you're treating the symptoms while avoiding the disease. You're rearranging furniture on a sinking ship instead of fixing the hole that's letting water in. And you're avoiding the hole because looking at it means acknowledging something you've built your entire identity around denying. Maybe what you're avoiding is grief you never processed. Maybe it's rage you were taught was unacceptable. Maybe it's need you learned to be ashamed of. Maybe it's simply the truth that the life you're living isn't the life you want, but admitting that would require changes you're terrified to make. Whatever it is, it's not going away. It's just getting more creative in how it gets your attention. The addiction, the anxiety, the depression, the compulsion, these are all just different costumes for the same avoided thing trying to force its way into consciousness. Jung talked about the need to go down before you can go up, to descend into the underworld of your own psyche before you can rise into wholeness. This isn't pleasant work. It's not the kind of healing that happens in a weekend workshop or through positive affirmations. It's the kind that requires you to touch what you've been running from your whole life, to feel what you've been numbing, to know what you've been denying. It's dark work, shadow work, the kind that transforms you because it forces you to become large enough to hold what you previously couldn't bear. The cure being in what you avoid means that your symptoms are actually breadcrumbs leading you home. Every compulsion is pointing toward an unmet need. Every addiction is showing you where the hunger lives. Every breakdown is revealing what can't be sustained anymore. If you can shift from fighting your symptoms to following them, from seeing them as the enemy to seeing them as guides, they'll take you exactly where you need to go. But that journey requires courage. Most people don't think they have. Here's the paradox. The thing you're most afraid of losing is often the thing that's preventing your growth. The identity you're desperately protecting might be a prison disguised as safety. The relationship you're clinging to might be keeping you from yourself. The career you can't imagine leaving might be slowly killing your soul. And you know this. Somewhere deep down you know this. Which is why you work so hard to avoid looking at it directly, because looking at it means having to make choices you're not ready to make. But avoidance has a cost that accumulates with interest. Every day you don't face what needs facing, the debt grows larger. The energy required to maintain your defenses increases. The gap between your true self and your presented self widens. Eventually, the system can't sustain itself anymore. Eventually, something breaks, and when it does, you'll be forced to face what you could have chosen to face earlier, with more support and less disaster. The cure is in what you avoid, which means healing is always available. It's not somewhere out there that you need to search for. It's right here, in the very thing you're turning away from. This is why Jung insisted that neurosis is suffering that hasn't found its meaning yet. The suffering is trying to show you something. The pain is trying to teach you something. The crisis is trying to wake you up to something. But you have to stop running long enough to listen. Making friends with what you avoid doesn't mean rushing into it recklessly. It means approaching with consciousness, with support, with the understanding that you're not broken, you're incomplete, you're not sick, you're in the middle of becoming, and what you're avoiding isn't going to destroy you. It's going to free you, but only if you turn around and face it, only if you bring light to what's been living in darkness, only if you finally say yes to the full truth of who you are, including the parts that scare you most. This is the final piece of Jung's insight. Transformation isn't about becoming something you're not. It's about becoming everything you are. And everything you are includes what you've rejected, what you've hidden, what you've run from. The cure isn't in fixing yourself. The cure is in finally being willing to be yourself, completely, without apology, without editing, without pretending. That's where freedom lives. That's where wholeness waits. Right there in what you've been avoiding all along. So the next time that urge hits, that craving calls, that old pattern pulls you back, don't just fight it. Ask it what it's trying to tell you, because the answer might be the only thing standing between who you are now and who you were always meant to become.